Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. It's an honor to be a presenter on this Day of the Experts. I realize that we have a lot of people streaming in, so welcome to you. Hope everyone there is warm. Um, so I just want to say a little bit about myself. My name is James Lee. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology here at UW-Madison. I've been here since 2015, and I've also been a Weissman Center investigator since that time as well. Um, most of my academic career has been focused on the study of the causes and consequences, and to some extent the treatments for childhood attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. And one of the things I've had the great privilege of having here as an investigator at the Weissman Center is a tremendous opportunity to be able to communicate and meet with many of my colleagues who are experts in autism or ASD. And as I've been here and as I've been doing my studies on children with ADHD, I have really come to realize how much overlap there is in the context of children with autism who also have signs and symptoms, and in some cases diagnoses that are also ADHD as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about where my research has been going, very recently in fact, as well as to focus a little bit more about what ADHD is in the first place. I've already heard some questions about that, and our previous speakers had mentioned it as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we currently know about its overlap with ASD, and then I'm going to end with some work that we're currently doing that's still in its preliminary stages, but I think is really exciting and hopefully will shed some more light on what exactly is going on when we say that these two disorders overlap. So let's start with what is ADHD. And presumably some of you may already know this, but for those of you who don't, here's a little snapshot of how the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, defines it. So there are two major clusters that define ADHD. The first major cluster of symptoms and problems are what are called the inattention problems or cluster. This has to do with the general inability to sustain attention or to stick to tasks or play activities for long periods of time, or to remember or follow through on instructions and rules, and to resist distractions. You heard this in the anxiety discussion that actually, if you think about all of these different symptoms, all of us probably will say that there are times when we can't sustain our attention or stick to tasks or activities or remember to follow through on instructions. So there's really nothing out of the ordinary if you yourself see yourself doing some of these things. But what is out of the ordinary is that when these types of behaviors become so impairing that it makes it difficult for you to do your job or to go to school or to learn, that's what we're referring to when we're talking about inattention symptoms from a diagnostic perspective. The other major cluster is the hyperactivity or impulsive cluster. This has to do with a set of symptoms that have to do with under control of motor behavior, a poor ability to inhibit one's behavior, and an inability to delay a response to something that's typically very rewarding. So these are typically children who might have a harder time saying no or refraining from getting that toy that they really want or wanting to play video games. They have a really hard time not being able to do that. So hyperactivity in particular refers to the under control of motor behavior. So this will typically manifest as having a hard time sitting still or fidgeting a lot while they're sitting still, even if they are sitting, squirming around, running around aimlessly. And another one that is actually used in the DSM is called being driven by a motor, as if they're like cars and they just can't stop. The other aspect of hyperactivity and impulsivity is, of course, the impulsivity, which relates to inability to inhibit immediate responses to really good stimuli that they're looking forward to. This might look like blurting out when they're, or interrupting others, or having a hard time waiting for their turn. So they typically might have a hard time waiting for their turn. There are multiple subtypes for ADHD. There are three. The first is the combined subtype or combined presentation. This has to do if when the child meets the diagnostic criteria for both the inattention cluster and the hyperactivity impulsivity cluster. So we would call a child who's been diagnosed with combined type, that child would have symptoms of both of those clusters. Then, of course, you have the predominantly inattentive subtype, and that, of course, would be a child who might meet all of the diagnostic criteria necessary for the inattentive cluster, but not the hyperactivity impulsivity cluster. And then, of course, you have the predominantly hyperactive impulsive presentation or subtype, and that's when they meet the diagnostic criteria for just the hyperactivity impulsivity, but not inattention. There are differing degrees of severity, as there are for many of the disorders of the DSM. I would argue that ADHD is also a spectrum. It's not currently called one right now, but as you can see, there is a slow movement towards that for not just ADHD, but for a lot of disorders as well. Okay, so I like to show this quote, especially when I teach about ADHD in class and speak to organizations about just exactly where this field has come from and where it is currently. So back in the 1960s, when we began our studies, no one believed such children existed, such children being children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Now people find them under every rock, and this was somebody who was a psychiatrist who was among the first people to study ADHD. There is an increase in prevalence in ADHD over time, not unlike what we've seen in ASD. This may or may not be surprising to you. So since 1997, where we've done national surveys to track its prevalence, we're seeing that there's a general and steady increase in the prevalence rate of ADHD. And these are all different national surveys that have been conducted on children. One of the more startling things about this is that its average prevalence is really high. So we're talking about between 9 and 10% of children currently are being diagnosed with ADHD today. So that's substantially higher than most other childhood psychological disorders, including, of course, autism spectrum disorder. That means that, in a class of 30 children, as many as 3 of them might have ADHD. And this increase in prevalence actually has an interesting pattern to it that we're also trying to understand from a research perspective. So this shows you in 2003, when the CDC was tracking prevalence rates for ADHD, they were doing them by state. And what you'll notice here is that tends to be a higher prevalence in southern states and some in the mid-Atlantic states for ADHD. So the darker color, the darker shade of green here represents 13% prevalence in that state and above. So as you can see, no state is around 13%, but they were between 9 and 10% in the southern region as well as the mid-Atlantic. And then if you look at the West Coast and even some of the Midwest, a bit lower. Here's what it looks like in 2007, so this is just 4 years later, and you can see a huge increase in prevalence in some of the Midwestern states, and of course some of the southern states as well. And the Western states still remain fairly low prevalence relative to some of the southern and mid-eastern states. And then here's what we see in 2011. So this is 4 years after this. The prevalence now is firmly above 13% in many states, including, of course, Midwest and the southern states and the mid-Atlantic. And then the West Coast remains about 7 to 9%. Now, there aren't updated figures since 2011 by state level, but as you can see, when I said that the national prevalence was 9 to 10%, that's not representative of the fact that some states have much higher prevalence rates than others. Now, I wasn't intending to go over why there are differences in prevalence rates across states, but I will say that there have been many potential explanations for this, some of which have to do with educational laws, and others have to do with things like being more aware of ADHD, and certain communities in certain states might have done a lot more to try to make it more aware among teachers in particular. There have been lots of studies that have been trying to understand this phenomenon that's been going on. It doesn't quite make sense why a neurodevelopmental disorder should look like this, and I'd be curious to hear any of your thoughts on this. But needless to say, it's a strange phenomenon, but one that does suggest that it is growing in prevalence, but it doesn't seem to be growing in prevalence consistently, depending on what state you're in. Okay, I want to talk a little bit also about treatments for ADHD. You've heard a little bit about that in the context of anxiety, and I want to continue that in the context this time for ADHD. we actually do have a gold standard treatment for ADHD as a disorder. And that gold standard was established by a randomized controlled trial that was led by and conducted and funded through the National Institute of Mental Health, called the MTA study. This was done in the 90s and published in the late 90s. It was a study that involved 3 different types of treatments. One was medications only, and they were looking at the effects of a stimulant medication. In this case, it was methylphenidate. The other treatment group was those who did a behavioral treatment. So specifically, these were kids who not only got individualized behavioral treatments on learning how to better stimulate themselves in ways that don't disrupt everyone around them, but they also got, the families also got a parent management training session, 10 of them in fact, where they learned how to better manage the behaviors of their children at home. And then the third treatment group was a combined treatment group where they got both the medication and the behavioral/parent management training. There was actually a 4th category. This is treatment as usual. Typically, a lot of randomized controlled trials have this category where a set of families and children with ADHD were told to just get whatever treatment you wanted in the community, whatever was available. This was the primary finding from MTA that has led to the gold standard treatment, which is to show you simply that the combined treatment group responded best and had the best outcomes in terms of what they said normalization, which is when you have symptoms that go all the way under the rate of, under the threshold of diagnosis. So these were children who were previously diagnosed with ADHD. They did the treatment, they no longer had a diagnosis of ADHD. So 68% of the children who were in the combined treatment group responded in this way. They normalized. 56% who just received medications only, this is the methylphenidate group, responded this way, and 34% responded in a normalized way to just behavioral treatment only. I should mention that all of the children in this study were children who had combined type ADHD, which would be considered the most severe type of ADHD. So in the case of a child who has the most severe manifestation of ADHD, they respond best to a combined treatment. And this is what is the gold standard treatment today. This is what pediatricians would recommend, is that you don't just get medications when you treat your child with ADHD. You should, as much as possible, to the extent that it's available, receive both, especially if your child has a combined type presentation. This isn't necessarily true if the child might have, say, a predominantly inattentive subtype or hyperactive impulsive subtype. So a little bit about parent management training, which is a part of the MTA study. This is a behavioral intervention that focuses on teaching effective parenting practices and strategies for coping with a child with ADHD. So it really does focus mostly on parents rather than the child themselves. It actually includes a lot of components from applied behavioral analysis, and its goal is to teach skills to parents, but also children, but mostly to parents, that help increase positive adaptive behaviors, typically in the home setting, and then to decrease maladaptive behaviors. This is Russ Barkley. He wrote a book called Taking Charge of ADHD that is widely used in ADHD treatments that specifically walks parents and clinicians through how to do parent management training in a very time-limited sort of way. All right, so medications. I know that some folks might be interested in learning a little bit more about the types of medications that are used. And I'm not going to necessarily go into depth on this, but I did want to share a little bit about what are typically being used. And we also have an expert here, a pediatrician who works with children and families with ADHD who can probably answer some of those questions better than I can. Stimulants are among the most widely prescribed types of medications for ADHD today, and has been for quite a while. Stimulants, there are different types of stimulants. Many of you may have heard of Adderall, for instance. That's what's called an amphetamine. But there's also Ritalin, which is an older type of drug, but it's still used today, and that's what's called the methylphenidate, as well as drugs like Vyvanse that are currently on the market and increasing in popularity. These are all categorized as stimulants because they all increase the amount of dopamine that's available in the brain. And not only does it increase dopamine, which is one of the neurotransmitters that's quite involved in the way that we process rewards, but it also increases NE or norepinephrine in the prefrontal cortex. And this has a lot to do with our arousal, our awakeness, our sleep-wake behaviors, and it also impacts our fight-or-flight response, among other things. So both of these neurotransmitters are impacted when children are taking stimulant medications. We also have another class of drugs that are widely used today to treat children and also non-children with ADHD, and those are called non-stimulants. And that really isn't all that different in terms of its mechanism from the stimulants, other than the fact that it doesn't primarily focus on increasing dopamine. So Strattera is a good example of a non-stimulant. Most of these drugs are typically released, if not all, actually all of them are released in the central nervous system, and they usually are released over time and fairly quickly once somebody takes them. In some cases, these drugs can last for almost 24 hours or longer. The longer acting ones are typically denoted as XR, or extended release. And typically, if you want the therapeutic effects of a stimulant, they need to be taken every day. Of course, as I said earlier, some drug companies are developing new mechanisms of delivery that one can take it once every other day instead of every day, because sometimes parents or individuals with ADHD might forget, which is actually a core symptom of ADHD itself. Okay, so what does the landscape of medications and behavioral treatments and whether or not people actually use the gold standard treatment for ADHD look like? So the CDC actually publishes a nice figure by state. As you saw in the figure that I showed you, there are different prevalence rates by state, but there are also different patterns in which people practice the treatment of ADHD by state. So I've highlighted Wisconsin here, and you can sort of see here in the top part of the graph that among children with ADHD, so these are individuals who've already been diagnosed with the disorder by a pediatrician or a psychiatrist, 81% of children who have diagnosed ADHD in the state of Wisconsin are being medicated. So these are 81% of any child who walks into a clinic with ADHD is likely to be medicated. Relative to the rest of the US, including DC, that's about 74%. So we're somewhat in line with the average, but as you can see, a bit higher. We're more likely, a little bit more likely here to medicate our children. So that may or may not be a bad thing necessarily, but let's look at behavioral treatment. So this was somewhat older data, 2009, 2010, 38% of children with ADHD in Wisconsin received behavioral treatment for ADHD, and this is reporting in the last 12 months, relative to the national average of 44%. So in the state of Wisconsin, we're a little less likely to have our children, or to recommend our children, or to have our children with ADHD also undergo some form of behavioral treatment. So what about both, that being the gold standard? Wisconsin is at 31%, where children with ADHD receive both medication plus behavioral treatment, and that's actually in line with the national average of 31%. I don't know how you all feel about that, but for me, as a researcher, this doesn't make me feel great, because we know from our research and evidence-based studies, RCTs, that the combined treatment is typically considered what everyone should be receiving, especially when you have a young child who's maybe 6 or 7. There are side effects of these medications that I unfortunately don't have a slide on, for which we actually don't quite know what will happen to a child's brain as they get older when they're taking these medications. And that's, I think, somewhat problematic. The impact of ADHD is quite profound, as you can imagine. So not only is it quite prevalent, among the most prevalent mental disorders of the DSM, in fact, but it also, as you can imagine, has a tremendous negative impact on academic functioning for that child. It's harder for them to sit still, and so it might make it also harder for them to learn. And it also has a very negative impact on social functioning. Typically, children with ADHD have a harder time making friends, and that has a negative lasting influence on the way that they develop in life later on. And of course, it has a negative economic impact as well. This was an estimate that was given by the CDC. In fact, almost $31.5 billion annual cost that ADHD has on our healthcare system through lost productivity and impact on other family members. So this is a highly prevalent and impactful disorder. Okay, I'm going to now transition to an area that's becoming increasingly interesting and also important to study, and that is the overlap between ADHD and autism spectrum disorder. So one question to ask before we even get into this is, can a person even have both of these disorders? Interestingly, for many, many years, decades in fact, the DSM actually said that you cannot have ADHD if you already have a diagnosis of ASD, and the opposite was true. And it wasn't until 2013, when the DSM-5 came out, that researchers finally raised their voice and said, this is preposterous. Not only can you have them, but there's a lot of value in having a dual diagnosis, in this case, of ADHD and ASD. Why is there value? It's because when there are symptoms of ADHD and they're very impairing on that individual, and maybe those symptoms are not necessarily what you would see in autism, right? They would require ADHD-specific interventions. And so the opposite is true the other way around as well. So there is a lot of value in studying this and treating the co-occurrence of ADHD and ASD. Now, in the DSM-5, they are all counted as part of the same clusters of disorders. They're all part of something that are called neurodevelopmental disorders. There's actually 6 of them in the DSM-5. You can see ADHD and ASD are like the first 2 that are shown, but learning disorders also fall under the category of neurodevelopmental disorders: communication, motor, and intellectual disability. So you've heard some examples of them in the introduction slides that Chung gave. All of these disorders are characterized by a similar origin. So many of them are early expressing problematic symptoms that you typically be able to see early in life. And they all have some sort of shared origin in the sense that they are led to, they're impacted by the impairment of the growth and development of the brain. So they impact brain development in some way. Maybe not all in the same ways, but they all impact brain development in some way. And those can then impact your emotion, the way that you regulate your emotion, how you learn, your self-control, and your memory. So there is a belief that having a disorder among this group of disorders, that you're very likely to share many of the same features as some of the other ones within them. So talking a little bit more about this overlap, what might this overlap look like in a clinic, say if your child does present with autism and might have some ADHD? So there are a few red flags to pay attention to, especially if you're a clinician or if you're a parent who might be concerned. The first red flag that I'll talk a little bit about, and this was identified in a recent paper that was written by psychiatrists in Europe who have been among the leaders actually in studying this overlap, is one of the symptoms of ADHD, which is often fails to give close attention to details or makes careless errors in schoolwork, at work, or during other activities. This is an actual symptom in the DSM-5 of ADHD in the inattention cluster. Typically in children with ASD, this isn't the case. Children with ASD are perhaps more likely to give close attention to details and not to make careless errors because they're so focused on a specific object or detail during an activity. But when a child with ASD does present with these types of this particular symptom, it might be indicative of ADHD. Here's another one. Often has difficulty sustaining attention in tasks or activities, or unable to play or engage in leisure activities quietly. This is more representative of ADHD than, say, ASD is, for the same reason that I mentioned in the first case. Another one that might be a red flag symptom of ADHD co-occurring with a child who already has ASD is often avoids, dislikes, or is reluctant to engage in tasks that require sustained mental effort. As many of you may know, children with ASD, particularly ASD in fact, they crave structure and repetition and things that are more rote and repetitive because they can expect something. In this case, often disliking engaging in activities that are that way would be more representative perhaps of an ADHD diagnosis. Often loses things necessary for task or play activities. You wouldn't typically find that in a child with ASD, but in this case, if they have those types of symptoms, that might be representative of ADHD. And then the last one that they pointed out as being a red flag was often being forgetful in daily activities. Again, you may not necessarily see that very often in a child with only ASD, but if you do see that, that might be reflective of a potential comorbid diagnosis of ADHD. This is the opposite, so this is if you're trying to identify ASD in a child with ADHD, so I'm not going to go over this slide, but there are some that have been noted as well there. How common is this overlap? So this is according to a study that was done about 8 years ago, so it's not exactly the newest study that I could find, but this is the best study that I can find by Scott Collins and his group at Duke. As many as 50% of individuals with autism spectrum disorder present with signs of ADHD. That is not to say that 50% of people with autism spectrum disorder have ADHD, but rather that as many as 50% present with signs or symptoms of ADHD, suggesting that there could be impairment related to ADHD that may not be treated. And then the opposite is also very true. Nearly 2/3 of individuals with ADHD, which is what I've been focusing on most of my career, present with features or signs of ASD. So this overlap is not trivial. It happens quite frequently, and it may even be expected given how common it is. Individuals with ASD are 22 times higher have a 22 times higher risk of having ADHD compared to those who do not have ADHD. So again, this is a risk that is not trivial and I think deserves to be studied, especially now that we can officially diagnose the two of them together. What sort of treatments do we have for the co-occurrence? So not about ADHD and not about ASD, which I'm sure many of you already know about, but what about if you have a child who presents with both? So I wish I had satisfying results and great things to tell you about our great treatments for this, and but we're working on it. We don't quite know what to do yet. But here's what is the current practice. The current practice is to medicate them. So compared to youths with ADHD or ASD alone, and this is from a study that was done in 2011, so not exactly the newest, youths with both of these disorders are the most likely group among those who don't, relative to those who don't have both, to be prescribed some kind of psychotropic medication. So when I say psychotropic medication, I mean any medication that's designed to target the brain in some way. So it could be an anxiolytic, it could be a benzodiazepine, it could be a stimulant. It's any drug, really. They're the most likely group to be medicated, and that, in fact, is the current practice. May not be the right practice, but is currently what has been done. There's no current compelling evidence, i.e. through randomized controlled trials, that indicate that children with ASD and ADHD even respond well to these treatments. So just because this is what's being done doesn't mean that this is the right way to do it, because we don't have any solid evidence from randomized controlled trials like the MTA study that has told us that this is the right way to do it. We're still searching for that. And in fact, there is some evidence to suggest that children with both of these disorders who are medicated don't even respond well to it at all. In fact, may actually be contraindicated. You heard from our previous speakers how you might actually make anxiety worse when you give a child you give stimulants to a child who might have ASD or might have anxiety. So that's one of the issues with our current practice right now, is that not only do we not know enough about what type of medication to prescribe a child with a co-occurring disorder, whether it's ADHD or anxiety, but we might even be making things worse because we don't know enough about it. So this is why I've become quite interested in this and have been able to rope in other people to become interested in this with me as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that we're currently doing, and I won't spend too much time on this because while it's very exciting, It's also just getting off the ground. And so we have a little bit to share, and I'll tease that to you today. I have predominantly studied my things of interest, ADHD and childhood disorders, from a genetic perspective. Why from a genetic perspective? Because many psychological disorders have a strong genetic basis. We've learned this over several decades of research looking at twins, where we've learned that, for instance, schizophrenia has a heritability of 81 or 81%, bipolar 75%, suggesting that the vast majority of the potential causes of schizophrenia and bipolar, at least 3/4 of it anyways, can be attributed to genetic factors. You can see here, this is for MDD or major depressive disorders, a little less. So it's not trivial, but it's 37%. And then here are the other two that we're focusing on today. Autism is around 80%. The most recent estimate is around 83%, so it hasn't really changed all that much, even with more data coming in. And ADHD here is 75 to 80% actually. So we're talking about two of the more heritable disorders according to estimates from decades and tens of thousands of twins that we've studied, some of which have been studied here, as a matter of fact. This is a complicated looking figure that I just want to show you and point out one thing. What we currently do in the field of genetics is we don't just focus on twins any longer. We can actually look at your DNA. Anyone here done a 23andMe? Anyone know about 23andMe? Right? So now you can actually pay a company and give them your spit, and they can read out your DNA sequence. Well, we've been doing that well before 23andMe. And there have been studies now on all sorts of heritable disorders and other traits like height, trying to look for, well, what specific genes are associated with these disorders? If we know autism is about 80% heritable, then what are the genes that are actually contributing to that 80%? That's obviously a really important next step now that we have the technology to do it, because once we identify what those genes are, we may actually be able to produce some therapeutics around them and even do something about that. So what this figure shows you is a sample of over 50,000 people with and without autism, one of the largest studies ever. It's actually a combination of many different clinics collaborating with one another who have all produced genetic information on their samples, and they've combined their efforts in search of genes for autism. Essentially what this study shows you, this is what's called the Genome-wide association study, shows you for autism, is that anything above this red line is what's considered a genome-wide significant hit. It was a gene that is so significantly associated with autism that it survives the burden of multiple testing. There are a lot of signals below this red line that sort of show some potential signal, but not strong enough, basically. These are the ones up here that are really strong. So you may not be able to see it because it's kind of faint, but there's actually a lot of signals that are associated with autism. And we've done this for ADHD too, and we're also seeing very similar things. Different signals across the genome, but signals nonetheless. What we're now able to do with this type of information is quite powerful. What we can do is actually genotype every person that walks into our research study, and we can then sort of aggregate and focus and hone in on all of those genes that have showed up in that big study that is associated with autism. We can measure which version of the gene that you have across all those associated variants up here. We can measure that in you, and then we can produce what is called a polygenic risk score for autism, meaning how many of those risk variants do you carry that has been already identified for autism. And when we do that, we can do that for everyone, whether you have autism or not, and we can determine how much more of the genetic burden for autism do you have relative to the typical person. And so this is an example where, say, if we genotype one person, this person has more than 89% risk, carries enough risk that they're at an 89% probability of potentially having autism. So this is a very powerful tool that we now have at our disposal as we've learned more and more about the genetics of autism, that we can combine things that we learn from GWAS to help us make potential predictions about where you might stand on the liability spectrum of risk for autism. And this goes back to the idea that autism is a spectrum. Your genetic risk is also a spectrum. And many of us actually carry genetic risk, and it just may not express. So I've done this type of work in the context of ADHD. This is just a recent study that I published not too long ago, looking at a very big data set called AdHealth that's got 15,000 adolescents in it. These are adolescents who are just from the community in the US. And what I'm showing here is what happens if you were to produce this polygenic risk score for ADHD in a normal population of adolescents in the US. This is what you find. This is a normal distribution. It's a spectrum of genetic risk that corresponds to your actual risk for ADHD. So if you're over here, all the way on the right, this means that you're 2 standard deviations above the mean in terms of your genetic risk for ADHD. You're carrying so much of the genetic risk for ADHD that you're higher than, say, 99% of the population in terms of your genetic risk. And when you're over here in the genetic risk spectrum, you're about 2 times as likely to have ADHD, and this is something that was measured in AdHealth. So this is information that's telling us that just simply having your genetic, your DNA, your genetic information can actually help us potentially diagnose ADHD. Not by itself, we're not that good yet because there's still a long way to go before we've identified all of the genes for ADHD or autism, but we're starting to get there, and it's starting to give us some clues as to just how much does that translate into real life risk for this disorder. Okay, so this got me wondering, given the overlap between autism and ADHD, that what if some of the genes for ADHD might actually be the same genes that we're looking at for ASD too? Here's another somewhat complicated figure, but one that highlights something that I just really want to point out. So this is a set of correlations. So on the bottom is R, which is this is a Pearson's correlation. And over here, you can see different types of traits. And what they've done in this particular study, this is a study that was done in 2019 in Nature Genetics, was that they looked at the genome-wide association scan for autism. So the graph, the figure that I showed you with all the little dots on it, and then the red line with all the dots above showing the significant hits for it. How correlated are those genes to things like IQ, educational attainment, self-reported tiredness, neuroticism, schizophrenia, major depression, ADHD, chronotype? What you're seeing is that most of the genes for autism are also associated with the traits that are typically associated with autism, like your IQ, educational attainment, self-reported tiredness, and, not surprisingly, ADHD as well. In fact, ADHD was one of the most correlated traits with the genetics of autism. This is really confirming our suspicion that when we're talking about overlap, it may not be just any kind of overlap. We may actually be seeing the same signals, the same genes are what's contributing to the overlap between ASD and ADHD and potentially other traits as well. Another thing that we've learned from genetic studies and also from some neurobiological studies is that many of these genes, both for ASD and ADHD, are actually enriched or overexpressed in the same brain regions. So it's the same signals are showing up in the brain as well. It's not just the genes, but the genes contributing to protein expression in the brain, and they're expressed in the same parts of the brain, which is quite indicative or suggestive that what we're looking at here when we're talking about overlap are some of the same signals. So what we're currently doing at the Weissman Center in collaboration with another lab here at the Weissman Center, the Motor Development Lab, is we're combining some of our efforts and our expertise to help us better understand really what the causes of this overlap are. So my lab, the Social and Behavioral Development Lab, uses genetic information from our participants where we have them come in, we recruit them into our lab, and we study their DNA, and we also study the home environment and the schools. So we're trying to capture not just the biology, but the environment as well. And we're combining that with really powerful and high resolution images of the brain to help us see if we can do a better job of distinguishing those who have both ASD and ADHD from those who might have just predominantly ADHD or just ASD alone. It's still, of course, very likely that there are some individuals who only have ASD and not the other, and vice versa. But the challenge right now that we've encountered is that we're not really doing a great job of diagnosing it. It's hard to find that. It's hard to do it reliably. And of course, we don't know how to treat it yet. So before you treat something, you ought to know how to diagnose it and identify it first. That's just my opinion. So that's kind of what we're focusing on here at the Weissman Center and collaborating with our wonderful experts here. And that's one of the great things about being at the Weissman Center as a faculty investigator is having such great collaborators like Brittany Travers, who runs the Motor and Brain Development Lab, so that we can better understand the causes, the origins that can ultimately lead to precision diagnostics, which is what we're interested in. So this is our set of guiding questions for our research project. Can genetic information be used to diagnose ASD, ADHD, and their co-occurrence early in life? That's one of our key questions that we're trying to answer by collecting genetic data from them. But with the incorporation of imaging data of the brain, can this genetic information also be traced to brain regions so that we know which areas of the brain to target in the development of new therapeutics? This will help us link the genetic signals that we find to the actual brain signals that we've also started to find. They have to, we want to see whether or not those are related so that it can lead us to some new areas to pursue for developing new drugs potentially down the line. We have some really preliminary results, but I'm really excited about them. This is actually data that's not from the study that we're starting here at the Weissman Center, which is just about to get underway. This is actually data from a large data set of individuals with diagnosed autism. This is, I believe, 50,000 people with autism. It's called the SPARC data set, and it comes from the Simons Foundation. And what we've been able to do with that data is we've been able to use our polygenic scoring models for autism, or ASD, to predict autism in the SPARC data set. What's interesting about this is that a lot of the folks in the SPARC data set also have ADHD. And one issue or one limitation of polygenic scoring methods is that they're not very precise. They're not very reliable. Remember that I told you that many of the genes for ASD might also be the same as the genes for ADHD, right? So if you're trying to see whether or not somebody has ASD just by looking at their genetics, you don't want that to pick up signals for other disorders too. You don't want that to be picking up things for depression or schizophrenia or ADHD. You want the signals just to be focused on ASD because eventually what our goal is to use genetic information to help us diagnose precisely. So this is essentially what we've been able to do using some cool bioinformatic methods that our other collaborators have helped us with. This shows the prediction of using genetics of autism to predict ADHD. So it doesn't really predict ADHD all that well in this sample. And it does even better job when you're refining the genetic signal just to be focused on ASD. And the same thing is true when we're doing it the other way around. Genes for ADHD only predict ADHD. We've started to come up with ways to be more precise using genetics to predict the thing that we want to predict. Yeah, so that's the idea here, is that genetic information may be useful for early diagnosis. And you've heard already the Weissman Center's mission. And of course, one of the key missions for us here altogether is that not only do we want to help families, but we want to do it early because early interventions have been shown to lead to better outcomes in most cases. This is the type of work that's been happening all over the place and has been going on for a long time in the autism world. You know, this is an example of a study that was done in 2013 where they've used eye tracking devices to study infants, where they've looked at infants' eye gaze to see how much are they focusing on the face versus something other than the face. And they're using eye tracking methods to try to early diagnose individuals or infants who might go on to have autism. Imagine if we can do this at the moment that they are born, where we can identify someone's risk for autism using only their genetics. So there's a lot of positive potential. There might be some negative consequences to that type of work as well. But we're very excited about what genetic information and neuroimaging information can potentially do to help us better understand the causes of these disorders, but also importantly, the causes of what causes the overlap between these two disorders. And with that, I'm going to end and field any questions that you have about this presentation. Thank you.